In this video we are going to take a closer look at the basics of building a Deathwatch army list aimed at beginners. This is the Arks of Omen updated version of my previous guide for War Zone Nephilim that I released a couple of months ago. Since then, a variety of rules have changed, including the loss of Armor of Contempt, the Big Points rebalance, as well as the new GT mission pack. First, we will quickly look at the relevant changes to rules and preparation steps. In the second part, we will dive right into army building itself, based on the beginner's list that we ended up with back in War Zone Nephilim. At the end of the video, there will be a quick summary of what has been covered.
Welcome to SwissHammer, your channel for modeling in Warhammer 40k. My name is Tammer, and I will be guiding you through this video.
Back when I released my guide to list building in War Zone Nephilim, some of you guys mentioned that it packed too much rules and preparation information, which could make it into a separate video instead. As a result, for the purposes of this video, I will limit the rules and preparation step to a few key changes introduced with Arks of Omen. For more detailed information about the different ways and points values to play the game, rulebooks and army building tools, see my previous guide for War Zone Nephilim, which I linked in the description. For Arks of Omen, the perhaps biggest change for list building is that we now have to use the Arks of Omen detachment as the default. This one adds a lot of flexibility by no longer locking us into 3 mandatory troops choices, but instead the other battlefield roles like elites, fast attack, heavy support, and even Lord of War can be taken. For the Deathwatch, however, unless going for some dreadnought heavy list, which we won't, sticking to troops is still the recommended approach, simply because our kill teams count as troops. Furthermore, we could also take up to 4 HQs, something to keep in mind. Then, like already in War Zone Nephilim, we are starting with 6 CP only and don't get a free relic and warlord trade anymore. For those toying with the thought of bringing along a Corvus Blackstar, it is important to note that flyers now must start in reserves, but at least putting something in reserve is now free of CP. Something to keep in mind for later. Ultimately, I think the important takeaway here is to regularly check Warhammer community for updates to points, balanced status slate or FAQs. GW is now making balanced changes at least quarterly, and any printed book very likely has some rules updates by now. Speaking of which, final note, our Army of Renown is gone and unlikely to come back until a future supplement completely reviews our rules. Then moving on to the final preparation step, the GT mission format and secondaries. 9th edition created a major shift here when compared to older editions by moving away from 2 armies just grinding each other to dust and instead focusing towards scoring primary and secondary points through holding so-called mission objectives and completing secondary ones. The latter can be particularly difficult for beginners, and you must choose 3 of them, and that can be quite overwhelming. Unfortunately, if anything, Deathwatch has lost out on secondaries when compared to War Zone Nephilim, mainly because our Deathwatch exclusives got reduced to 1, Call Order, which is niche at best and will rarely see play. This means we will have to mainly draw from Space Marine or the vanilla secondaries, which are all listed in the Arks of Omen GT mission pack. In a nutshell, there are separate categories of secondaries, and you can pick only 1 of each. Of special note is also that the core secondaries assassination, behind enemy lines and grind them down, now provide a CP gain when done by the troops battlefield roll, which of course ties nicely into our kill teams. As a general recommendation, I would suggest trying 1 of these, with grind them down as a default, and the other 2 heavily depending on opponent. Furthermore, I think banners remain a winner, and we potentially get to take more bodies now that there were points discounts across the board and the AUR restrictions are gone. This is my default go-to, with the mentioned grind or even oaths being a good second pick, and the third is usually taking the least bad, could be anything from shock tactics to bring it down or even assassinate. For the purposes of this video, I designed the list with the previously mentioned secondaries in mind, but I also wanted to make sure that there is not too much rules overload and that the list is offering a fun playing experience with decent enough models. With this lengthy introduction out of the way, let's finally dig into the list building itself. For those familiar with my previous beginner guides, the list I presented there looked as following. For HQs, we had the Captain on bike, a Phobos Librarian and the Primaris Chaplain on bike. For troops, we went with a mixed unit style of Indomitor kill team, a Clangby style Proteus kill team, an Infantry bike Proteus kill team, as well as a Spectrus kill team with Eliminators. For elites, we had a Primaris Apothecary and a Redemptor Dreadnought, as well as an Eradicator squad as heavy support. I also took this list as the base for the Army of Renown version. In case you have been following along either of these lists, that's basically our starting point for making the Arks of Omen changes. Personally, when I am starting a list completely from scratch, I would take a 4-step approach. Auto includes which are the units I absolutely want to have in this specific list. I then proceed by meeting the detachment requirements, add additional units I need to round the list up, and finally fill any potential gaps or cut some points. In this particular case, however, I would recommend a moderate transition from War Zone Nephilim to Arks of Omen without throwing out all the models and having to relearn a list completely from scratch. Beginner or not, this is what I personally do all the time, because at least I feel more confident knowing that I can adjust to the new changes with mostly stuff I already know how to play. Should this not go anywhere, one can always start from scratch for future iterations. Looking at our HQs, the good news here is that we can mostly leave them as they are. In case of the Captain on bike, he now benefits from free war gear, meaning we will equip him with a Storm Shield and a combi weapon of choice, which could for instance be either a combi Melta or a combi Plasma. Either will do fine. The important part here is that we need a Storm Shield to upgrade him with the Dominus Aegis relic for the 5+ invul bubble, which is now an auto-include again when bringing along Primaris kill teams due to the loss of Armor of Contempt. I would recommend taking the Captain on bike over the Watchmaster again, exactly for this reason. The bubble aside, the Captain on bike is easy to play due to good mobility, a large base, with the latter helping to give some hit rerolls to our core units nearby. With the loss of the Army of Renown, the Lord of Deceit Warlord trait allowing us to redeploy some Phobos models has to go back on a Phobos HQ, for which the Librarian is ideal. We also want a Librarian for the 2 great Deathwatch exclusive powers fortified with Contempt and Primorphic Resonance. I will have it said that I think the upgrade to a Chief Librarian is well worth it now, and Mantle of Shadow makes for a great third power, but I did not find the points in this particular list. In case you end up with an iteration that can allow for it, I would absolutely recommend it. Anyway, the Librarian is primarily there to cast the powers on the kill teams, and as such should be kept as far back as possible, out of harm's way. Then for the third pick, no change there. Primaris Chaplain on bike is an ideal carrier for the beacon, with his good movement. He's also quite durable, and his litanies are far more reliable when he gets the Master of Sanctity upgrade with the corresponding Warlord trait. Overall, these remain a great trio for our HQ picks. Moving on to the troops, where our main strength, the kill teams, can be found. As far as I am concerned, these are still the main contributors to a successful Deathwatch list, especially now with sticky objectives and the likelihood that other armies will perhaps invest less into troops with the new Arks of Omen detachment. I recommend to go with a minimum of 4 kill teams, and the good news is that all of them have viable compositions in Ark of Omen still. For our beginners list, here we have a first major change. Unfortunately, the Infantry Bikes Proteus kill team has taken a major dent, with the price of veteran bikers going up to where Outriders came down to, meaning that we are better off running the Forest kill team with 4 Outriders instead. With the free war gear changes, also remember to include an Astaris grenade launcher on an Intercessor, as well as the Thunder Hammer on the Sergeant. The main goal here is to always combat squad this kill team with the 4 Outriders and the Sergeant, making them ideal for snagging objectives by chaining the big bases, as well as move blocking. With Armor of Contempt gone, their chainswords in Assault Doctrine, plus perhaps the Gene-Rod Mind stratagem on top, makes them even decent in close combat. That plus the Thunderhammer Sergeant, of course. Next we have the Indomitor kill team. Ironically, aggressors are now below the price of even Bolter Inceptors, meaning we will change the mix to 4 aggressors and a single Bolter Inceptor, keeping the latter for access to the fall back and shoot stratagem. This kill team is usually played as a big brick and highly benefits from multiple layers of support like the 5+ Invul Bubble, a Feel No Pain save, and the Apothecary healing and resurrecting as needed. For the remaining Proteus kill team, the infamous Clangby style kill team, we can add back in some durability by swapping a Van Vet for a Terminator, plus we can equip all the Vets with Storm Shields, plus either a combi weapon or a Power Fist. The Sergeant also gets a free combat shield, while the Black Shield and Biker can swap their chainswords for a power weapon instead. The kill team itself still plays pretty much the same, with the main goal here being the delivery of the hammers into close combat. Lastly, we have the Spectre's kill team. Here I had to drop one eliminator for an Incursor with free Haywire Mine, purely for points reason, though I think either variant has its place. These are always played in combat squads with 4 eliminators plus the Helix Adept, allowing us to benefit from double Deep Strike Deny bubbles. Moving on to the elites, here we are keeping the Chief Apothecary as is, though we are now paying less points for him. He's great in infantry heavy lists anyway. In addition to the one Redemptor we already had, we can now take another, even though I want to give a little heads up here. With the release of the Brutalis Dreadnought on the horizon, I am personally eyeing the switch from Redemptor to at least one Brutalis, but this depends on the final points and viability of the datasheet. At this stage, unless you already own double Redemptors, I would hold back from making any investment until we know more about this. I will certainly follow up on it in the near future. Either way, Dreadnoughts are easy to play, act as solid distraction carnifex, and in the Deathwatch we can give them the 5+ Invul Bubble or deploy them through the Teleportarium. Then last but not least, for heavy support, we are keeping the Eradicators for anti-tank power, again making use of some additional war gear, and one interesting strategy would be to deploy them through the now free strategic reserves. All in all, while aimed at beginners, this list capitalizes on several Deathwatch core elements. The durable Indomitor plus support characters for contesting the mid-board, the fast chaplain for litanies into beacon, flexible deployment with the Phobos units, screening out our backfield or messing with the opponent's deployment, a close combat murder brick, the mobile infantry bikes and some action monkeys, the beginner-friendly dreadnoughts, and the dedicated anti-tank in the shape of eradicators that can be deployed through the now free strategic reserves. While this does make good use of the Arks of Omen detachment and war gear changes, the overall list adjustments are relatively light, allowing us to continue playing with the majority of the models we already had before. On a side note, I generally advise against investing too much into the same datasheets, as this is not only annoying to collect, but also runs the danger of rendering a large part of your army obsolete in one go. If you are seeing lists advertising something like 21 missile launchers, stay away, regardless of who suggested it. Then lastly, if all of this sounds overly overwhelming still, nothing wrong with getting a few deathmatch style practice games in with a beginner friend and move on to more dedicated mission play later on. To wrap things up, over the course of the video, we have looked at the basics of list building, adjusting our War Zone Nephilim beginners list to the Arks of Omen changes. Of special note here are the new Arks of Omen detachment, sticky objectives for troops, the loss of Armor of Contempt, as well as reworked secondaries, which unfortunately did not end up being all that favorable for the Deathwatch. Unfortunately, we do no longer get access to our Army of Renown either. On the other hand, relatively few changes to the old list are required, with a few key elements being the return of the Dominus Aegis relic, Proteus infantry bikes being replaced by the Outriders variant, and the sum of points reductions allowing us to squeeze in another Redemptor Dreadnought. Speaking of which, I recommend keeping the eyes open for the upcoming Brutalis Dreadnought, which might end up being a more interesting choice for us, depending on points and final stats. I will follow up on this as soon as the information becomes available. So that's it for building a Deathwatch army list for beginners in Arks of Omen. Any additional advice from the more veteran viewers, and how do newcomers feel about these latest series of changes? Let me know in the comments. Finally, I would also like to mention that there is a SwissHammer Facebook page where I will be posting links to my videos as well as articles I find of interest. I do read a lot about the hobby, but not all of it will always end up as its own video. I look forward to seeing you there as well. I do also have a Patreon page. If you like my content, any additional support is greatly appreciated as it helps me invest into future videos. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. I hope you have been enjoying this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again and see you next time.